Ali Heppenstall, Executive Director at Climate Action for Associations. This morning we're talking about the important role of internal comms and employee engagement in relation to your organisation's net zero strategy. I'm joined by Jennifer Sproul, who is CEO responsible for the leadership of the Institute of Internal Communication. The IOIC is the only independent professional body dedicated to internal comms. IOIC is also the voice of internal communication, setting the standards for more than 75 years through qualifications, career development, thought leadership, and best practice. Jennifer is also a regular speaker on the role and value of internal comms to organizations and is the co-host of the podcast, The Future of Internal Communication. IOIC, I'm really thrilled to say, is a member of Climate Action for Associations, and they're also committed to accelerating change and working with CAFA on its own emissions calculation. IOIC are taking part in CAFA's Net Zero Association program of support. And welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks,
I'm also, hi Jen, I'm also joined by James Hand. So James is co-founder of Giki, and Giki specializes in helping people cut carbon emissions. Giki is a mission-driven B Corp and has worked with over 100 businesses to engage their employees on sustainability and helped over 150,000 people to take action at home and at work across 100 countries. James is a sustainable behavior change specialist and a data scientist, and he was previously co-CIO at 91 Asset Management, a FTSE 250 asset manager with extensive experience in behavioral science and company emissions analysis. Welcome to you both. So just setting the scene from CAFA's perspective. So Climate Action for Associations, as you know, and I think it's fair to say, I forgot to say this from the outset, Giki is also an accelerator of the UN-backed high-level Champions Race to Zero campaign, and CAFA, Climate Action for Associations, is part of that collective as well of organisations who are committed to accelerating climate action across business and industry. And that is our role. But this webinar today isn't just for associations, it's for everybody working in any organisation, whether you're in the private sector, public sector, third sector, in the association space. So this conversation is all about how to engage with your employees and how to communicate climate action internally. So I'm going to come straight to you, Jennifer. This is such a big topic. And it's one that comes up over and over again at CAFA in relation to when we're delivering our net zero program of support to organisations, but also dealing with the members of membership organisations as well as businesses or individuals, individual professionals. And it's huge. So as the Institute of Internal Comms, I know you've done some amazing research. Did you want to just outline what you see the most important critical issues are?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ali, for having me on this. And I think that if I take that kind of criticality of issue, I'll start with, I think that what I think is a really important scene set, I guess, and then down to kind of where I think some of those issues exist between internal communication and what its role is in its partnership with sustainability. I think from a broader organizational importance, and sometimes it is that language of how we need to secure that buy-in from our stakeholders, from our leaders about why actually investing. Yes, they've got the point around we know that, I think in our research, 90% they have a sustainability strategy. But it's the point of going, well, why is that really important to make sure our employees are on board with it? So we've got that part of it. We know that's really important, but why is it really important to have employees? And in our employee research and what we know about kind of what that expectation is of employees and those coming into the market is that 62% of employees now expect their employer to stand up for the big issues in society, and one of those being climate change. That is an expectation now that employees are increasingly placing on their employers and will impact their trust of their employer, their engagement with their employer, but also their advocacy for their employer. And I think in today's environment, by what we say and what we do inside and outside has much more business criticality than it just being something, well, we know we've got a strategy, but we don't really need to worry about how it's cascaded and how it's engaged and advocated through our employee network. It is absolutely critical that it doesn't sit in its own isolation pocket, the sustainability strategy. It has to come through the organization. And then when we look at it from that perspective, so we know that people have got it, then we hit this disconnect. We hit this kind of issue where something around, in our data, only 37% of internal communication professionals are either significantly or extensively involved in communicating the sustainability strategy. And that is an expertise then that is not being built in, I think, in an aligned and integrated way with the sustainability strategy. And then you ask internal communicators, well, who are connected to the employees, and they're looking at that as their audience. How do you think their level of understanding is then as the employees? Do they understand it? Do they know what their behavior changes? Do they know how they can personally contribute? Because I'm sure James will talk about as well, we're only ever going to make those big statements or big things that we put out there happen through collective action and through collective behavior. And if we've got to the point where we've got it up here, but it isn't connecting down below, then that's not going to happen. And we know that from our research, they say only 45% of employees understand what their role is in sustainability strategy. So you can see the metadata about why it's so important from a business critical perspective. Then you can see organizations get sustainability, but they're not making the connection, I don't think, and utilizing the skill sets of really drilling on an internal communication and employee engagement. And I think that's a big issue of alignment we need to be looking at.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing is that there's quite a big disconnect between organizations measuring their emissions or measuring their product life cycle assessments, whatever it is that they're doing, putting net zero strategies in place, but then not necessarily engaging with the people within their organization around how they're going to achieve those goals. James, why is engaging, it sounds like a really sort of stupid question really, but why is engaging employees around sustainability really, really important?
It's important because every company will reach a point where unless they engage their employees, they're just not going to hit their targets, because it is the employees who are going to be doing the work day to day, week to week, to make it happen. And I actually think you're starting to see that now, where lots of companies in the vanguard have set targets, hopefully aligned to the Paris goals, joining up to initiatives like the UN Race to Zero. And the next stage is, right now we've measured, well, what are we going to do? Whether that's through formally coming up with a transition plan or informally coming up with some sort of background carbon reduction plan. And that's when they go, right, we need people. And it's people at all levels in the organization. We need board support, board leadership to tell us what to do. We need senior managers engaged in coming up with a strategy. And we need the main sort of body of employees knowing what is it that's relevant in their day-to-day roles that they have to do. And unless companies start to kind of put that together, that kind of all-encompassing like view of it, which is relevant to the individual, and that's not easy, then they're not going to hit their targets. So yeah, it's basically we're the people that are going to do it, and so we have to be engaged.
Actually implement the activity that's required to reduce emissions and become net zero. Jennifer, you mentioned a statistic just before. So with that in mind, what James has just said, so how many, did you say it was 43% of employees are actually involved or are currently aware, or did you say
only 45% know, as in I'm in my job, I not only do I understand the sustainability strategy, but I understand what I am supposed to do with it. So that's less than half the workforce are actually then actively, collectively creating the behavior or doing the work, as James said, that's going to enable the organization to reach that target, because they just don't feel connected to it. And I think a lot of that is, and I think James hit as well, is making it personal is really going to be, I think, a key. But also that I think is the language of sustainability as it drills down the organization becomes very hard, I think, for some people to access and to understand. They get the broad message, perhaps. Yes, I'm in agreement with that. But when it comes down, and we find this across many things in our work, that employees don't understand their role. They get, it's great because they've made and I think the bigger the organization, the harder that is, the more complexity there is to doing that.
So I guess that's the intersection then between internal comms and employee engagement. It's like you needing employees, needing to engage employees and be really clear on the asks of them in relation to net zero sustainability. So what are the gaps then? So why are organizations not getting this right, Jennifer?
I think obviously organizations are setting out on the right foot. We're seeing obviously the growing role of head of sustainability, head of responsible business. You know, they're really investing in that side of that technical side of the workforce that is taking that on board. So it's becoming, I think this is my personal view as well, another siloed profession within the organ, or a siloed community within the organization, that then is perhaps operating in some regards disconnected from other functions that have different expertise. Because understanding it, we know it's a complex topic to understand carbon emissions and the technicality of all of that and how that works. So I think that what we're seeing is that is growing, but the connection with the internal comms function hasn't materialized. And when we've asked internal communicators, you know, why aren't you working with the sustainability departments? I mean, and a lot of those answers are things around, well, number one is we don't have the resources to support because internal comms is underfunded, and we have so much as an organization to communicate that we don't have time to take this on. The other one is, well, it's not in my role, so it hasn't been written into my job spec as an internal communicator. That's somebody else's to-do list. And then the next one is a separate team that sits somewhere else, so it isn't in mine. Or the other one we'll get right down to it is, well, it's not seen as a priority for our internal comms from our leadership and our stakeholders. So there is that, like I say, that disconnect, I think, in the way we're designing the interrelation of our functions and how they collaborate together.
Our experience at Climate Action for Associations in working with membership organizations and then helping them to engage their members is almost this sense of the organizations wanting to just sort of figure it out first, and then they'll communicate later without necessarily considering like a strategy and adopting standards and applying a process of emissions reduction or around a specific area of the business requires involving the business, but not necessarily it's in entirety, but communicating the vision at least, and getting that buy-in from the outset. And interesting, you just mentioned something there about large organizations as well. We work a lot with SMEs. So organizations that don't have a sustainability lead or a chief sustainability officer. In fact, that's the majority of the types of organizations we work with. So they're struggling to get their heads around internal net zero and sustainability themselves, and aren't sure themselves if they're understanding, let alone being able to communicate that across their business, which is quite a fascinating place, which is the kind of almost like encouraging it to be a sideline. It's like a stream that's happening within their business that sort of sits over there and it's not ready to be pulled across yet. And talked about as a separate entity, a little bit like liken it to like diversity and inclusion, say 5-10 years ago, was seen as something that needed to be looked at over here, and then obviously starts to be integrated into organization as over the last few years. James, what are you seeing the common challenges that organizations face, and what are you seeing in terms of Giki, the sort of work that you're doing to try and alleviate that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those things that you've been talking about really resonated. So thinking from like the real top level down to the kind of individual specific. So at the very high level, one big challenge has been that priorities keep on shifting. And kind of just taking a bit of a step back, we had like the Paris Agreement, then in the UK we had Glasgow, and then we also had the global pandemic. And in different ways, they created a real momentum behind sustainability. Obviously, Paris really kicking it off, the sense that we can do it. Glasgow because it was in the UK and seemed to be a continuation. And the pandemic, because there was a sense, if there was one positive thing that came out of it, it was the sense that we were going to do things differently now. Now, fast forward 3 years, and a lot of that's gone away. The COPs have been less exciting, supportive. Some of the language has been kind of watered down a little bit. Companies are facing, whether it's inflationary pressure, geopolitical problems, the cost of living crisis for their employees. And we kind of came back to do things that we were doing before the pandemic. There wasn't this big shift. So I think there's been a sort of, we talked to kind of quite a lot of people at the senior level, and this idea that sustainability is on the boardroom agenda. You know, we were hearing it's number 2 or 3 item on the agenda. And now we hear, unfortunately, it's not really even on the agenda. So there's that kind of high level shift going on. But then as we kind of go to the kind of the employees and how it affects them, I think the challenges we often hear are, number one, just simply time. The most common thing we hear about sustainability is something of the phrase, it's a side of desk thing. It's something that I do because I'm passionate, kind of in addition to my work. And that means people aren't just getting the time that they need to do it. And that links to the other part, which is the skills. And the skills are difficult to put together. As Jen was highlighting, you know, smaller organizations, like there's a really important kind of foundational set of skills that people need to understand, even if it's just the reporting requirements, which are not straightforward, through to the kind of increasingly specific job relevant technical stuff that people will need, whilst also appreciating that different people are at different stages on that journey. So it's, I get it, there's not so much time and they're shifting priorities, but it's also not easy to kind of reskill like a huge number of people for these things. And then the last one, actually, I thought was interesting. You mentioned there about like this sense that some companies don't want to put themselves too far out there. And I think that is a bit of a reaction to the fact there's been some great companies right in the vanguard who set some really, really strong targets. And the bit that they're now really scratching their heads around is scope 3. Like, what are we actually going to do to hit this, especially with our suppliers? And so this idea that it's much more important to focus on progress than perfection, which I fully subscribe to, that is now making people think, well, before I even do that, how am I going to achieve it? And that's great, because in each of these areas, there are things that we're seeing that are coming through. So on the latter point, climate transition plans are a new big thing. We think they're going to be huge in terms of how people think about the plan. And the more companies put them out there, the more best practice everyone else has got to follow to see how they're doing it. So that is great. The skills and the training, more and more companies are putting together, you know, really basically following their methodologies for normal learning development, replicated in sustainability. So you're seeing a real upskilling there. And this is more kind of a deeply held belief, but it just comes from the simple fact that sustainability is not going away, whether that's unfortunately because we see more climate crisis, whether more positively because we're starting to see areas where the economics work in favor of sustainability, it's going to come up the agenda again. So the best example here is just simply renewables. It is just cheaper to build solar and wind, depending on where you are in the world, than fossil fuels. And that fact alone will drive seismic change. So it forces up the boardlet agenda because it's suddenly a double materiality thing. It's an economic decision, a financial decision, as well as the sustainability decision. So lots of challenge, but nothing in there that isn't currently being solved.
Yeah, worked on. I wanted to highlight the point there that you made around skills, and I'm just going to jump on that. As at CAFA, we advocate the role of the membership sector, in particular trade associations, and their role that they play in relation to transition industry and business, but also professional institutes that actually we encourage wholeheartedly to really start embedding skills, future skills, green skills into their qualifications and training, whether or not it's an institute that is a regulated profession, that requires a license to practice, or whether there's a non-mandatory professional body or some type of society that actually looks after their profession and industry. And we're really advocating all of them to start to embed even just basic climate and sustainability awareness, communication skills, Jennifer, and information and guidance pertinent to their profession, to help those professionals working within organizations to understand how they can implement their climate sustainability into their day-to-day roles, regardless of what type of organization. So there is a real role for the membership sector to play in this space. So Jennifer, with that in mind, what current news channels and tactics? Oh, there was something else actually that James mentioned earlier around employees and the disconnect between board and sort of strategy, and actually it's falling off strategy. To what extent is internal comms actually being used to, I guess, manage up in that sense, to actually engage with board?
I think that's something that's kind of been the evolution of internal comms. If you go back to the internal comms function, I think historically, and we've come from that very much kind of broadcast background, right, where internal comms is really starting to evolve and moving forward as a professional community. That's why building in our own knowledge and training and skills and sustainability is going to be, I think, really critical to the members in the profession that we serve, because at that point, not just sustainability, but we talk a lot about big trends, because you need to be able to sit in a room with leaders and go, if you're thinking about doing that, don't do that, because that won't hit in this way, or do it in that way. And that's, I think, something that as internal communicators, we're getting more and more time of in the boardroom than we ever used to have. We certainly have seen the value that leaders place on internal communication significantly increase. And the pandemic was, I think, a great part of that. But with that as well, there's been some sort of waning and sort of, stabilizing with that, because I think we're still trying to find what that means. But in terms of that piece around communicating strategy, that's the fundamental role of an internal communicator, is to take the organization's strategy, communicate it to a workforce, make it understandable, and let people know what it means to them. And that's the bit we keep falling down on. We just released some research from employees last week, where we looked at how that goes, the 3 aspects of, do I know it? Do I understand it? Is it clear to me? Do I believe that that's the right direction of travel? But then, do I know how I personally contribute towards that? And it's the third one that continuously being falls down on. And then that impacts how the strategy is being delivered. So there is more ear of leaders, because I think they do look to us to help them, because fundamentally you're not going to deliver, whether it's your strategy, your sustainability, without the people around you being invested in to deliver it. And I think more leaders are keen to have that conversation and be given that advice than ever before. But they're certainly, if we look at trust, we think that they're only 55% of employees trust their leaders. So I think talking about people managers is going to be fundamental. Wow.
And prior to this conversation, we were having a chat in the pre-meet around your statement that attention is power. Does that applies up as well as down, by the sounds of it as well?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think from the employee perspective, so what we're seeing as internal communicators, we have a mix of channels and tools and methods to engage employees. That's the tactical delivery. But before you get to the tactical delivery, what you're saying, how you're saying, and how you're making it relevant to the individual and how are you following that up in the behavior and the role modeling of your organization is going to be fundamental. But then let's assume that's all kind of working, and then we're using our channels, whether that's our intranets, our newsletters, our briefing our line managers, and our cascade, and that socialization point of view, which I think is going to be fundamental for sustainability. When we get down to all of that, on average, we have about 15 minutes a day where an employee is going to consume that kind of information.
Wow.
So being able to connect with them into something that's relevant when they're probably getting a lot of communication about different things. That's why attention is power. So that's going to be, I think, from a communication tactical angle, one of our biggest challenges is making it cut through, getting their time, and then getting their attention to see it, and then their time to consume it, to then enable them to make their own action.
So just to recap, you said 15 minutes a day.
Yes.
That employers have to cut through to get the right messages across their employees.
Yeah.
Okay. James, how do you reach a broad audience in an organization and not just necessarily those individuals or those employees that are already, green champions and bought into a sustainability agenda? If we've only got 15 minutes, for example, and that would be to cover off a whole range of organizational issues, obviously not just about the net zero strategy or sustainability.
Yeah.
What can organizations deploy?
It is, as you've both highlighted, that is difficult, because there are those groups. You mentioned green teams, green champions. We call them super greens. And they are they're the bunch of people where if you say something eco, green, sustainability related, they're there, whatever it is, they want to participate because they have a deep passion about it. But since we started Giki, we don't think that group has actually grown very much. Because if you've been worried about climate change, you've probably been worried for quite a long time now. However, the next group we call the busy but awares, which I think links exactly into this kind of area, they have grown very, very quickly. So like the awareness about climate change, the concern about climate change, the desire to take action, whether that's at home or at work around climate change, that is a very big group. But at the same time, to really kind of get to that broader audience, one of the things that we've found is that it has to be about more than just sustainability. It's almost got to be, this is good for your health, plus the company wants to do this, plus your KPIs now include this measure around sustainability, so straightforward self-interest. And all those things, when you focus on like the co-benefits where sustainability is kind of the add-on, that kind of really fires up that group because they are busy, they want to do something, and they want to do something about climate change sustainability too. So that really helps. And that's from trying to come up with those really leading comms that Jen highlights that are so important to get the cut through to some of the things we do around sort of competitions and challenges to make to have some fun and make it engaging, learning from some of the things that we've seen in employee engagement over kind of many years to reach those broader audiences. And I think if you can do that and get that time, and to get that time you need the backing from the company as well. And that's something we see a lot, that if there is what we call the kind of the dream team of sustainability, internal comms and a senior leader, then you've got like a really good chance of getting your fair slice of that 15 minutes a day. And when you do, people are amazing in terms of what they can achieve and what they're up for.
Does that, I'm just thinking about what Jen said earlier, does that then perhaps place the organization at risk that the rest of the business will go, well, that's not that, we don't do that because we've got a green team over there that's responsible for that or leading on that. I really like your point, James, around how those, did you say busy but aware? I love that group. Know a lot of those. I guess it's connecting the climate action and sustainability strategy internally, like you say, to their KPIs, etc. But then communicating that reduced emissions could lead to an increase in profit or surplus, which could then lead to an organization that's more resilient and more profitable, and therefore the reward could be increased, etc. So in terms of those different departments, whether it's finance or HR in relation to greater employee benefits or KPIs in terms of line management, then the pressure then comes again to how do those individual departments know, or what is the relationship between them and their sustainability strategy, net zero strategy internally, and how's that been communicated and joined up. I mean, it's fascinating. Where if you've got one school of thought where you've got some really proactive champions who are sitting there doing great work, but it sits over there, versus those that know that they would like to, not sure how to go about it, and are waiting for incentive and a style of leadership that might not necessarily be coming through. It's fascinating. We at Climate Action for Association, so we work with a lot of organizations, and they have dream teams, green dream teams, and they're amazing, they're fantastic. But we are seeing that that's their job kind of mentality coming through. James, do you have any takes on that? Like, how can we crack that, or is that genuinely an internal comms issue?
I think it's kind of it's a lot of the above, and that sort of that bridging the gap between those two groups is so important, because a lot of green teams don't feel that they've got the budget to drive these big changes across the organization, and the time, as I mentioned earlier, and the busy but awares aren't kind of quite sure what they need to do in some organizations. Not all, though. Some organizations really have cracked this, but as you were saying there, it's kind of it's the combination that becomes key. So you have like a base kind of hum of awareness raising that you've got to get going in the background about why this is important, and then you stack on top of that the actions. What is the strategy? Where do we need to go? And then that is where organizations, well-run organizations, are exceptionally good of kind of cascading that down through the organization to work out what that means for different teams. And that's where things like KPIs, the targets, whether it's everything from companies in the vanguard setting an internal carbon budget to just knowing what the data is that they need to do, and linking it back to those ideas of how is this going to help us as a company. One great one there is where clients are asking for greater disclosures. Because if a client is asking for disclosure about something related to sustainability, that is a great business reason to get out there and get it. As we were saying earlier, with the employees, there's also this huge upsurge in employees who also want to do it. So that can kind of pull in too. So I think that's that kind of sense of it can't be the green teams are amazing, but they're also constrained in what they can do. And now we're kind of seeing that sort of shift, but not because it's about sustainability, but because it's about good business. Yeah,
business imperative. And that demand coming from customers and clients, so bottom up, I guess, is becoming increasingly important. There's a lot of pressure being faced on our community associations by their members, wanting to see them take much more proactive action internally, and putting really strong science aligned climate policies in place. So it's interesting to see the demand supply of all of this. Jennifer, what channels and tactics for sustainability communications are the most effective that you've seen from your research?
I think it does marry a lot with what James is saying in terms of that most effective. Those that, when we've asked internal communicators, when you've done campaigns about or initiatives about what it has been by and large that is about a focused campaign. It's when you see it where it's a considered campaign that is, I think, at the heart of it, driving that awareness piece to get that going as an organization. It's not about necessarily, you can never say one channel over another, because channels are about where your people are at, and your people are always going to be at, whether that's remote, disconnected, online, or whatever. So it's about making sure that you connect with them at the channel that's right for them, but you do a dedicated campaign. That is the most effective way of doing it. It's when it gets least effective, I think, perhaps, is when it slots down as number 5 as a news story and just sits very quietly in the background. So again, I think that it was like that, but I think what James said earlier was really interesting, that the pressure seems like it's dropping off a bit. So therefore we can put it down the list of the stories. We don't need to make it feel consistent. But I think when we do dedicated, consistent, and campaigns that have a long-term plan to them, it's it's the psychology of things, isn't it? You start with awareness, then you get ready for change, then you start, and we've got to take people through that process and cascade it down. And if you're going to be measuring against action, that's the most important thing. And I think the other thing I would say that I think we've understood as well, which I think is something we need to work on, which will really help, is we're not very good at measuring those campaigns and how impactful they have been, so that we can create that data point to re-say where we need to go next. I think something like we only 58% measure the impact of our sustainability campaigns on what they're doing. So again, I think this is this disconnect about, well, we know campaigns work. We know if we go in this journey, it works. We've got a robust campaign plan. We know how it's going to work. We know the messaging. We know how we're going to cut through. It's integrated. So it's not only broadcast, it has involvement, has employee voice. It uses our green champions. It uses all those sorts of pieces of information. And then we can see, well, what did that have? So we go to the next phase. So that's when you get another stall, I think, because you've done that bit and you haven't really understood it. So then you sort of, where do you go next? And I think that the biggest thing that also really succeeds is when you do involve the employees. And I think in our research, it's a small amount of campaigns have, or not necessarily campaigns, sustainability initiatives have employee involvement baked in from the outset. So for me, it's dedicated and involvement from the outset are the two things that are going to make that have the biggest impact.
And would that be generally work related, or does that then start to stretch into them on a personal or a society or community level?
I think it depends. I think both. I think if you're starting out with genuine involvement, and if you think obviously one of the biggest enablers of engagement, if you use Engage for Success, is employee voice. That's fundamentally what they say, one of the 4 enablers of engagement. And if at any point before you're designing or assuming this message is going to land, because I think that's the right message, and language and the power of language is so important. If you've gone beforehand to understand how people feel, know, think, consider the language of sustainability and what it means to them personally and how it relates to the business, enables you to really use that to then inform that strategy going forward and make them feel part of it. But in terms of designing those communications, I think it's only 12% have employee voice as a major or primary driver, and only 38% have a considered involvement. So it feels like I'm telling you rather than I'm coming with you. And I think those are two different things in these kinds of initiatives that make a big difference.
So not necessarily involving employees in a physical sense, like asking them to.
What do you feel about it? How does it wear in your role? How do you feel about it personally? What are your biggest concerns? What have you seen in the way that you do things that you think isn't sustainable? Or have you had any ideas that we haven't heard, or things that we could change? That helps you to bake in that campaign so it feels bottom-up driven rather than top-down.
And when you say campaign, you're talking about the communications campaign internally. You're not implying that sustainability should be approached as a campaign internally. You're talking about when you're integrating into your strategy, the campaign you would use to communicate that.
How you broadcast what you're doing and make that feel involved, so it was understood and actioned upon.
Amazing. So James, is there a difference between, from your perspective, when Giki talk to employees at work and versus at home? Like, what are the big distinctions, and are the lines blurred? We were talking about examples before around, employee demand or customer demand. What sense are you getting, home versus work?
Yeah, I definitely think with the rise in home working over the last 4 years, it's definitely got a bit more blurred. There were, though, kind of quite blurry lines before that anyway, around areas like commuting or your approach to plastic, the food choices you make in the canteen or at home, and just how your kind of sense of self in terms of sustainability. But what we've seen is that helping people understand what they can do in their own lives is quite a good way to raise awareness generally, as well as giving them kind of actions. And most people we find do want to take some sort of action, dependent on where they are in their own sort of personal journey. But when companies then get involved in that too, it's really, really important that they connect the dots. So as an example, we sort of do something around digital footprints, talking about people's, streaming an email or the devices that you buy, what you do with them afterwards, the kind of the e-waste, when you turn them off, those sorts of things as a way to kind of raise awareness and understanding of how you can cut your digital footprint, mainly focused on home. But what we've seen is when we do that, it's really important that the company kind of dovetails with that, saying, what are we doing about e-waste? What are we doing about storage? What is our email policy? Why do we give you a device every 3 seconds? What is our explanation for that? And often you find that they're actually moving in the same direction. And when people get that kind of consistency of message, feeling that they can take action in their home life with their family, with their friends, and at the same time their work is kind of following a similar path, then it becomes very, very positive for behavior change, because you've got more and more of your kind of close group around you who is making that change, your colleagues and your firm, your family and your friends. And in the end, for behavior change, we're social animals. And people like us doing things is the most common reason that we change. And so, yeah, when it's tied together like that, homework doesn't really matter. Consistency is almost more important.
That learned behavior. I've just noticed that we've got a couple of questions. I'm just going to. So the first one I can see is, and jump in. I don't know who of you, or maybe we turn to both of you to reply to this. But how much does culture play a role? So Abby's asked, empowering teams to develop or find and try any innovation, allowing for some failure and sharing of knowledge widely of successes internally and externally. Culture, who sets the cultural tone? And I guess if there's a need internally to change and adapt culture to reflect being more a green organization or to achieve a net zero strategy, who's driving that?
I mean, it's a big debated thing, but I think fundamentally when that debate happens, the answer generally is, with regards to who drives culture, it is set by the behaviors and the actions of a corp within an organization of the leadership team. And if you think of culture, it's the behaviors, the habits, the institutions, the rituals that we create, and it comes down to that point around psychological safety and how we create psychological safety within organizations. So if we think about who owns culture, the leadership team is often the answer, but everybody owns culture. But I would say, depending on the size as well, it gets quite complex, because you have culture and then you have cultures. So then you'll have a culture at team level. And because it is the behaviors, the norms, the way that we treat each other, our rituals that creates that sense of culture. And if you have a toxic culture that is sort of precedent, or a culture of any kind that is a negative culture throughout the organization, where speaking up and having an idea, the general habit is to go, we don't welcome ideas, or to shoot someone down, or you have a culture or an action where you're thinking about employee voice and you sort of go around going, we care what you think, tell us what you think, the staff survey, the engagement survey, and then there's silence. That creates a culture and a habit and a view that this environment is one where they don't want for our feedback and it's not welcomed. And listening and feedback is some of the biggest issues, I think, in culture and leadership behavior. So yes, absolutely. Because if you're trying to solve something through social action, and going back to that psychological animals, and that's how we work, and we want to make those changes at the smallest levels to the biggest levels. If you have a cultural environment where change is not welcome, involvement isn't welcome, or it is felt that what we say and what we do isn't aligned, then that is not going to help it. So yes, I would say you probably have a bigger problem to solve that then will enable that to drive through in the organization.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really interesting that what you say and what you do isn't aligned, that misalignment. And that's obviously where potential greenwashing or greenhushing comes into play. And James, as you were saying earlier around employees wanting, a lot of employees expecting and wanting a lot more from their employers, some great statistics around that. In terms of culture, from your perspective, what's your experience on employees driving employer culture?
I really agree with Jen's sort of sense that it comes from the top, but then it's carried and embodied by everyone else, and that's the kind of the deep complexity of it. We have though seen a few, like in every case, a few sort of exceptions to that rule, and they're really nice to see, but we probably shouldn't read too much into them. But like we have one client where actually it was a group of graduates got together and decided that the firm needed to kind of engage their employees more around sustainability. They created a network that grew to hundreds of people. They took it to the board and they kind of implemented this change. And it's really, really inspiring. And I wish there were more like that. But those are unusual compared to the kind of the broader set it from the top and then sort of take it all the way through. But it does show though, you know, culture is a sort of very hard thing to pin down. So whatever works.
All right. From your perspective, is culture and values the same thing? So an organizational culture, if that's misaligned to the values of employees, I'm thinking specifically around climate aligned policies. So if an organization is working with clients in the fossil fuel industry or other industries that are high emitting, and their employees are discontent with perhaps a lack of change or progress being made. Are you seeing much of that?
You do see a bit of it, and that dissonance between what the kind of, whether it's the culture, the values, the strategy, the outward facing kind of marketing materials, if that is at odds with what is actually happening, that creates a lot of internal uncertainty, complaining, like lack of clarity, all of the above. That can be quite sort of pernicious over time. But I'll also say conversely, the opposite is true, that when you get that alignment, then you see some really sort of powerful change, some quick change. But yeah, I mean, it's the old classic, say, you know, do what, just be consistent and do what you say you're going to do, and right through the organization, people appreciate that.
No, definitely. And I think, what's your sense on employee engagement and talent and in search of talent? Are organizations losing out on talent and skills because they perhaps are misaligned in terms of their actions and policies?
Well, certainly a lot of people now say that they will think about changing a job if the company's kind of environmental direction isn't aligned with where they think it should be or where they are as an individual. You also hear some people talk about its importance, even compared to other areas like sort of pay and that sort of thing. And so I think all those are true, that it's coming up the agenda. But just like there's a bit of a gap between what we'd all hope to do in terms of being green and what we actually do in our own lives, I think it's probably true of this as well, that how much we kind of state this is really important compared to the action it takes. But it's there, and it probably wasn't there in this way probably even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. And so that is, yeah, if you want to kind of attract a group of talent, those super greens I mentioned earlier, it's absolutely important. If you want to attract the others, then as a kind of a really kind of an extra thing that people increasingly look to, yeah, that helps too. Not to mention retention on top of that. If you can, holding on to your great people is just as important as finding the new ones. In fact, probably even more so, because you've trained them, you know them, and you kind of respect them. So yeah, it's definitely an increasingly important kind of area for people outside and inside.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing there, Jennifer, is that consistent communications that are really in line to organizational strategy is absolutely key. Have you got anything to add to that? I could see a few comments coming through the chat. There's one in particular saying, Brewdog are a great example of how an organization helps employees understand their own personal carbon footprint and their pets as well, apparently, exclamation mark, and will offset it. Interesting. Big but, with the proviso that individuals will make continuous reductions themselves. They provide lots of tips and recognize those who make great progress, sharing how they achieved it. So that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Is in the promoting and showcasing those employees perhaps that are doing great work. How much do you think that plays into then inspiring and encouraging others?
I think it plays a huge part in it. And then I think when I was talking about that campaign, I guess what I'm trying to say is what's our IC comms ongoing strategy, and how it all forms part of it. And the fundamental is, at the end of the day, if we think of trust and we think of where we believe, and how we always say as well, do the neighbor test when you're talking about a message. Does your neighbor understand it? Do we make sense to it? Do I know what to do with it? Right? Because if you knock on the door and go, well, you know, so I've been talking to this, we're going to reduce this responsible business in this way, and we're going to do this kind of, it doesn't resonate when you go, well, if we're going to tell us about your pet, we'll give you that for your pet, and then we'll give that an offer. Oh, I get that. That makes sense. It feels really actionable. And I think a really important part of any narrative that we build is showing evidence of what you do is working, showing in a language that they can say, oh, I did that small thing and I've made a difference. Pride is really important to tap into as a human emotion. And I think, remember, I think we're in the business of emotions. When we're talking about this, we're in the business of connecting people with a emotionally connective. I think there's nobody you'll speak to that doesn't care about the planet and the climate. But there's people that you'll speak to that will go, but I feel I don't have a role in that, and I feel disconnected from that. So you know they're going to emotionally probably connect, but they don't know how to personally connect. And then once we see, oh, my neighbour's done that, I can replace what they did. That makes sense to me. And we share those stories, and we use storytelling and the narrative of others who are just like us or doing good work. It creates that emotion. It creates that, oh, I can see how I can get involved. It's a really important part of pulling all that together, I think.
I'm conscious. Oh, sorry, go on, James.
Sorry, very quick. I was just going to say those stories, they really have to be attainable for people, and also not in any way judgmental. Not that you need to be like this, but these are the things you could do. So the story about Brian from accounts who lives off grid, built his own solar panels to fire up his laptop, is not helpful to most people. The things that other people do that are closer to them, then great. And and never telling people what they should do. That just immediately, in all areas, but I think especially in sustainability, just turns people off.
That's interesting. So in terms of internal comms strategy, they're dictating, setting out specific codes of conduct and practice, etc. Jennifer, you think wouldn't work for organizations?
We need policies, okay? This is a lot of what we do is baked into our policies and our technicalities and what we're doing. But policy isn't really a human language. It's not really a human connection point. And I think not just in this, but in many policies, I think that one thing organizations need to work on is making the policies feel human, and so I can create that behavior. And making it feel accessible in a way, and something that means to me. And when we've looked at things around language, that's been the biggest barrier around picking up on James's point about how we're talking about it. And I think, that's a lot of things in policy, because then it feels very officious. It feels very like you're going to tell me off. It feels, if you just think about that language and what it emotes to you and what you'll do with it. I think policies are needed, but how we articulate them needs to be reviewed differently.
I guess connecting them back into, James, something you said earlier around connecting back into KPIs, purpose of the organization, relating it back to income and results. Would you say?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you in work, you can kind of tell people a bit more what they need to do, because that's the structure of how things work. I was kind of referring a lot more to in their personal lives, where as one example, if we start a call about food with the line of, cut back dramatically on your red meat, you have 5% of the audience cheering wildly, and the other 95% turn off and go, I've heard this all before from people in sustainability. It's utterly unhelpful. If you paint people the picture of all the things they can do, from food waste to plastic to the food choices that they make, and you set out that kind of buffet almost of ideas, then most people will find something. And that's the progress as we continue to where we need to get to, but not not kind of like in the next 30 seconds.
Yeah, amazing. And we've got 3 minutes left, and I love ending any conversation I have like this with sort of your top takeaways. But I think the resounding thing that's come out of this for me is that need to absolutely be able to articulate really clearly to build culture and values. There's a very big distinction between those green champions and those busy but aware, and being able to relate it back to role and integrating communications and employee engagement in relation to sustainability right from the outset, that initial plan. But I guess two of the biggest things is you've only got 15 minutes every day to break through, to have that message and create that engagement. James, if you had 3 things that you had to leave the listener with today to help them set a really strong employee engagement plan of action practically, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think what you said at the end, first one, have a plan. Like that'll get you a long way. You need a North Star as you kind of go through this. Secondly, get senior leaders involved at the start, so they support the plan. And then thirdly, as we were just discussing, get the tone right. And those three things as a headline, I think, can really be a good foundation.
Amazing, James. Jen?
I would say my 3, very similar to James, but I would say my 3 is connect and align your cross functions and everybody involved when you're creating that plan. Have a task force that has your sustainability, your engagement, your people, because it's a connected, and so that plan feels wholly owned from the right stakeholders in the business, and the alignment and understanding individual responsibility to drive that forward is really important. I think involving employees in internal in things that you do, so that you're empowering them or listening to them, I think is a really important part of that. And I think thirdly, my thing would be is we have around I think an average attention span of 8 seconds. So attention is power. Use the 8 seconds effectively to get their attention. Think about our language, but then with that as well, make sure that we can cut through the noise so that we do that. So attention is power.
Amazing. Thanks, James. Thanks, Jennifer. Also, with probably 8 seconds left to go, I'm going to try and wrap this up. I'm always going to link this back to the role of the membership sector, associations, societies, professional bodies. You absolutely have a crucial role in engaging your own employees on this and communicating well internally. And accelerating your own net zero strategy, as well as supporting your members to do the same thing, whether your members are individuals, professionals working in a specific professional industry. Start to embed climate communications and awareness, even at the most basic level, into your curriculum or your core competencies. And likewise, if your trade associations having to engage in a really important area on sector-specific information or just general climate awareness, think about all the things that we've discussed today. Employee engagement and internal communications is absolutely critical. Your organisation isn't going to be able to either set, plan or implement, adopt any kind of net zero strategy and implement change without your people. People are organizations. Thanks again, Jennifer. Thanks, James. Really interesting conversation. And I hope for those who are listening enjoyed it too. And good luck for the rest of Climate Action Week. I know it's a busy week for everyone.